In the Center for Global Knowledge Studies, we have a special interest in epistemology. And thus, Inanna has managed to bring that interest together with a range of disciplinary and regional traditions. We have a special focus on agriculture because many technologies, norms, practices that embody knowledges of the world and how these knowledges have globalized over time can be observed in agrarian contexts. In my personal research, I've been focusing on the resistance against one particular rapid such globalization of agricultural knowledge, the Green Revolution. In the course of this research, again and again, the role of land seemed paramount to me, but not always was it clear how to exactly understand and conceptualize this role. Agrarian movements in particular attribute special significance to the land. And my hunch is that to understand the societal conflicts that we're currently seeing around climate, food, and much more, we have to understand the relations of movements and institutions to the land on which they draw and which makes their practices possible in the first place.
I was just looking at law for the longest time, and before I knew, I was looking at land as something very central, displacing all my previous conceptions and frameworks. So I owe much of this work on land and law, not to nebulous academic processes or research, but to some of my profoundly transformative experiences from my fieldwork in Canberra. A lawyer out on a field work where it is not necessary doesn't necessarily throw up spectacular results, except for myself. But when I left my field work, I moved away from a land that's limited, life that was led while being placeless in a way and devoid of connections and entanglements. I was placed as a guest on the stolen land of Australia, and that is when I realized the sense of care and belongingness. In retrospect, I went on a fieldwork not to obtain data, but to situate my work and present it to the people I was writing about.
So today I will present a paper that is based on several years of research and collaboration among Afro-descendant communities in the Colombian Caribbean, particularly in an agrarian region called Montes de Maria. I'm going to share my screen because I want to show you, at the very least, show you a map. I'm a geographer, as Felix said, and we cannot avoid maps, although we criticize them all the time for being colonial, but we do it anyway.
It's what I've tried to do. Have I approached the question of the land and epistemology? It struck me that the idea of land as capital is a dominant way of thinking about, indeed hegemonic way of thinking about land today. But from my own research, I could see that this is one which is certainly historically contingent and certainly subject to a process of development that I think is not totally self-evident.
All right, let me jump right in. The paper I wrote for our discussion today was motivated not only by this webcast series, but also by what seemed to me like a paradox. On the one hand, we know ever more. So research on rural areas is proliferating, and policies are also increasingly evidence-based. At the same time, things are not getting any better, no matter how you define better. The number of people who do not have sufficient food is growing, and it has been growing even before COVID. Poverty and inequality might have been twisted here and there, but they also remain largely unchanged. And of course, there are various reasons for this, political and economic. But I would argue that it also has to do with the knowledge itself that we create in the process of trying to address all these inequalities. A knowledge that is simply not very helpful for a proper transformation.
And I'm an archaeologist, and most of my work is very empirical. But I thought it was like a good opportunity to share with you like some ideas that I've been having through like different projects and over a long period of time, and just get some feedback on that. So I think one of the important things is that you take these, I don't have the aspiration for this to be a scientific work, really. It's more like, an exercise in deductive logic. and sort of like an attempt to make some sort of cross like cultural comparisons in order to reach not necessarily to reach a conclusion, because if you read the paper, you see it's not exactly going to have a final answer to the question. But one of the things that I heavily criticize archaeologists is about their lack of imagination, because we have a limited, most archaeologists have like a very limited range on what are the possibilities of certain environments and what are the possibilities of certain interpretations. And I think we would benefit quite a lot from sort of engaging in this type of discussions.
So here's my, so this is Gulu Market, Northern Uganda. So I don't just talk to communities, I go to the marketplace. Early morning is great. And so I asked about each one of these and when they cooked. And on this side is the CGIAR iron fortified. And the whole point is this is what people are eating on the left. And this is what is being grown for the future. And the whole purpose of this chapter for me is a way to return to, we knew about millets in the 1960s and 70s. We forgot. We have an opportunity now through climate change to think about learning about them again. And in a way, I guess it's a cautionary tale about we don't want to lose this opportunity to break that model and to do a bottom-up where not just the knowledge, but the value of each step in that process of cooking where human beings are at the center could, at least this time, be mapped, be recorded, be the driver for what it is that we value for sustainable agriculture.
What do we know land to be if we take seriously its always shifting relational character? In my own work, I aim to make post-socialist rural spaces epistemically generative. I think there is a wider problem of overlooking the global East when talking about political ecologies. And I think this invasion is partially visible in the geographical focus of the series as well. But more than this, I want to highlight the methodological problem that I'm grappling with: how to approach human-soil relations without confining them to specific concepts that we are used to thinking with, be that policy, territory, or property. This is then to ask not only how we can know land through specific relations, but what else we might know from human-soil relations.
I thought I'd begin with a question. When we think of land, what do we imagine? Maybe we think of hearth, maybe we think of home, or perhaps soil, or animal and plant life, the so-called natural world, or perhaps land connotes history, tradition, or culture. And we might note en passant that the word culture is etymologically linked to the word cultivate. Yet in his foundational book, The Great Transformation, Karl Polanyi points out that under the system of free market capitalism, modern capitalism, land emerges as something completely, radically different. Land is birthed as what he calls a fictitious commodity. Now, by fictitious commodity, Polanyi means that land is treated as if it were a marketable asset, something that exists solely to be bought, sold, and owned. So Polanyi means fictitious in a very specific way. Land is constructed as commodity, and thus a land market is made. But in the process, other understandings of land as biosphere, as home, as way of life, these are bracketed off, they're diminished, they're occluded.
And so I'm actually going to try to just maybe discuss some elements of the farmers' protests in India, thinking about actually how there's a particular mode of capital accumulation that bears upon kind of, or it clarifies how epistemology becomes a site of contestation, right, for the kind of either the intensification of capital accumulation in agriculture or its potential overturning.
So rather than speaking about land directly, I approach these kinds of earthly questions through soil. Soil in this context, I understand as a particular institution of governing natural and social worlds, which might include land. one that changes through time, but also has a series of continuations, and it's those changes and continuities that I'm interested in. And not to equate soil to land might be a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's important because to me it highlights the multifacetedness of these entities, soils, and lands that we are talking about. So I'm always a bit hesitant with reducing soil to land because it seems to be to reducing land or soil to any particular aspect, whereas we should take this multifacetedness that also the previous panelists here have alluded to as a starting point of analysis. And simultaneously, I think for me it's important as a move to denaturalize soil. So approaching soil as a particular institution, I feel means approaching it as resting upon particular sites of practice, technology, and knowledge. And this includes, for example, the soil scientists, soil maps, land use policies, but also artifacts like fertilizers, which stabilize and promote particular soil epistemologies. And this denaturalization of soil serves to underline the situatedness of approaches to land and the need of interrogating how the situation of encountering, understanding, and responding to land is constructed, also in an analytical sense.
What is striking is that the agrarian paradigm constitutes a real rupture or disruption in our evolution. And so this leads me to think that in addition to explaining why a lot of it is actually unnatural to us, it is very much entirely related to the development of our knowledges. And so there is a sort of meta problem, an epistemology of epistemology. I think Shailaja used that term a few weeks ago, that there is a metacognitive impact of the agricultural revolution that has transformed very substantially our epistemic imagination for the future. I'm not sure what I want to conclude from all that, but I find it quite striking that of all the technological innovations that we've had in our history, very few of them actually shifted our natural evolution. But the agricultural paradigm managed to do that in a way that seems to have put us on a completely different track. And I think that this is, at least certainly in philosophical and also in explanatory terms, in theoretical terms, something that should be explored. Because if we are to actually to become able to imagine different futures, then we have to be able to think about what a different epistemology means. Otherwise, we will keep developing exactly the same tools that have led us to a sort of epistemic impasse.